The airplane was buzzing with anticipation as passengers found their seats, some chatting softly, others staring out the windows lost in their thoughts. The air felt heavy with the hum of the engines as the flight attendant moved quickly up and down the aisle greeting people and checking seat belts, a familiar routine she had done 1,000 times before. But today, something felt off. Something was about to happen that no one could predict. In the middle of the aisle, an elderly woman slowly shuffled down, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, her steps slow and labored, the weight of her carry-on bag hanging heavily in her fragile hands. She tried to lift it, but her arms trembled with every movement, beads of sweat starting to form on her forehead. The woman looked around, hoping for help, but no one seemed to notice her struggle. The flight attendant was standing near the front, watching impatiently, her eyes scanning the crowd. When they landed on the elderly woman, a brief flash of annoyance flickered across her face as the old woman made her way down the aisle. "Come on," the flight attendant muttered under her breath, the irritation clear in her voice. She glanced at the other passengers, as if she were waiting for someone to hurry up so she could finish her task. But the woman continued at her slow pace, every step heavy with the weight of age and exhaustion. The young attendant's patience was wearing thin. Finally, the elderly woman reached her row and stopped to lift her carry-on into the overhead compartment. But the task seemed nearly impossible. The woman struggled to stretch up, reaching for the compartment. With a shaking hand, the flight attendant stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes narrowed in frustration. The seconds ticked by and the tension in the air grew thicker. The woman's hands were trembling now, beads of sweat rolling down her temples, and the attendant could see it, but didn't care. "Can you hurry up?" the flight attendant said, sharply, louder than necessary, the words harsh in the otherwise quiet cabin. "We're trying to get this flight moving," she added with a dismissive glance at the elderly passenger, who flinched slightly at the tone. The elderly woman looked down at the floor, her face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes avoiding the harsh gaze of the attendant. She muttered a quiet apology, but the words seemed to fall flat. The flight attendant simply turned away and moved down the aisle to assist the other passengers, as if the elderly woman was just another obstacle in her way. In the midst of all this, there was someone watching quietly, a figure seated a few rows back, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. Morgan Freeman sat perfectly still, his expression calm, but his eyes intense with a quiet wisdom, as if he could see everything that was happening in that brief moment of interaction. Freeman's gaze never left the elderly woman as she finally sat down in her seat, still visibly shaken and uncomfortable. He could see the frustration in her eyes, the hurt, the quiet resignation of someone who had been treated like an inconvenience, a burden for simply existing. But Freeman knew something needed to be done. He felt the injustice of it rising within him like a storm, but he remained calm, his mind already turning over what would come next. The cabin felt heavy now, the tension building, as the flight attendant moved down the aisle, continuing her rounds with no clue that she had crossed a line, no idea that someone was about to make sure that what she had done would not be forgotten. The flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, without a second glance at the elderly woman who had just taken her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. But as she passed by the elderly woman, a small sigh escaped the old lady's lips, a quiet sound that could easily be missed. But in that moment, it echoed through the cabin like a cry. For help, she gripped her armrests tightly and glanced out the window, as if to escape the sting of humiliation that lingered in the air like smoke. The attendant's actions were fast, almost mechanical. As she moved from row to row, she didn't pause for a single moment, not for the elderly woman who had struggled, or for the growing tension in the cabin. As more and more eyes began to watch the situation unfold, Morgan Freeman could feel it too. Something was off. There was a wrongness in the air that was palpable. It was more than just the flight attendant's impatience. It was the way she dismissed a person simply because they were older, slower, more vulnerable. He could sense the unease of the other passengers, each of them watching with quiet discomfort, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. But something told him that silence was not an option. Freeman's mind was racing as he sat there waiting for the right moment to act. He had seen too much in his life not to recognize when something needed to be done, when an injustice was allowed to slip by unnoticed, when kindness was overlooked. And yet he knew that it wasn't his place to intervene in every situation. But this one was different. It wasn't just the old woman, it was the disrespect that she was being subjected to for no reason other than her age, her vulnerability, and the flight attendant's coldness. As the attendant moved to the back of the plane, Freeman stood up, his slow, deliberate movements drawing the attention of the passengers around him, his voice calm and steady. As he made his way down the aisle, past the rows of startled faces, he could feel their eyes on him as he approached the attendant, who was already in the middle of another round of seatbelt checks. But Freeman didn't hesitate. "Excuse me, miss." His voice was clear and unwavering, cutting through the hum of the cabin like a knife. "I think you may have missed something back there." The flight attendant turned quickly, her face still cold, but there was a flicker of confusion in her eyes as she looked up at the man who had spoken to her, his face calm but firm. And there was something about the way he spoke that made her pause for just a split second. The authority in his words made her stop in her tracks. And for a moment, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath, the passengers looking between the two of them, wondering what would happen next. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm very busy right now," she said with a hint of annoyance, still brushing him off as if he were just another passenger with an insignificant complaint. But Freeman wasn't deterred. He held her gaze, and the moment lingered longer than it should have, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing second. "I understand you're busy," Freeman said calmly, his voice never wavering, "but there is something that needs your attention, something much more important than what you're doing now." The flight attendant's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the first time as she realized that this wasn't a routine complaint or a trivial interruption. There was something deeper here, something she had missed, something that the passengers were waiting to see how she would handle. He stood there unwavering, his presence in the aisle growing larger with each passing second as the words he had spoken hung in the air. The flight attendant could feel her heart rate increase just a little as she realized the gravity of the moment, and for the first time since the elderly woman had boarded the plane, she felt a slight pang of guilt creep into her chest. Freeman didn't break his gaze. He knew the power of silence, the power of a few carefully chosen words, and in that moment he knew he had made his point. But it was up to her whether she would understand it or not. The entire cabin was watching now, waiting for something to shift, something to change. The flight attendant's gaze flickered with uncertainty for a split second, but only a split second before her professional mask fell back into place. She cleared her throat and took a step back as if to distance herself from the confrontation. But Freeman didn't move. He stood tall, unsteady in the aisle, his presence demanding attention, as if he had all the time in the world to make sure the point was made. For a moment there was an uncomfortable silence. The other passengers were waiting. No one said a word, but the tension in the air could be felt by everyone. It was thick, like a fog, settling over the cabin. The elderly woman, sitting quietly in her seat, was now watching with a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes, as if she too knew this moment was important. She knew something was about to change, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it yet. She wasn't sure if this would be just another moment where she would be ignored or dismissed. The flight attendant shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She was caught between two worlds now, between the expectations of her job and the uncomfortable truth that Freeman was forcing her to face something she couldn't ignore. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she stared at Freeman, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to figure him out. But Freeman didn't flinch. He just stood there, his eyes steady, locked on hers, like a calm river that couldn't be disturbed. "I said you missed something back there." Freeman repeated, his voice still low, but now with a quiet authority that carried through the cabin. "The way you spoke to that woman, it wasn't right, and it needs to be addressed." The words hung in the air, and for the first time the flight attendant seemed to realize the weight of the situation. She could feel the eyes of the entire plane on her. Every passenger was watching. And they weren't just watching to see what would happen next. They were watching to see if she would step up and do what was right, or if she would turn away and pretend it never happened. The flight attendant's face flushed. She knew the rules of her job. She knew how to keep things running smoothly, how to manage the flow of passengers, and ensure the flight was on time. But she had never been prepared for this kind of moment. This was something different. This was a test of her character, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. "I didn't mean to be rude," the flight attendant muttered almost apologetically, but her tone lacked sincerity. It was the kind of apology someone gives when they realize they've been caught, but aren't quite sure how to fix it. Freeman wasn't buying it, not for a second. "It's not about being rude," Freeman said slowly, his voice still calm, but now tinged with an edge of disappointment. "It's about showing respect to others regardless of who they are, or how slow they move. Respect isn't earned by speed or efficiency. Respect is earned by kindness and understanding." The flight attendant's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment she looked away from Freeman, her eyes flickering toward the elderly woman, whose gaze had not wavered from the conversation unfolding in front of her. She had seen everything, and she felt the weight of Freeman's words deep within her bones. Freeman didn't wait for an answer. He knew that sometimes the right words weren't enough to immediately change a person's heart. But he also knew that the seed had been planted, and that was enough. He could only hope the flight attendant would recognize the importance of her actions. The elderly woman looked up at Freeman, a soft but grateful smile beginning to form on her face. She nodded slightly as if to acknowledge his efforts, and that small gesture was all Freeman needed. He gave a small nod back before stepping aside and walking toward the back of the plane. The flight attendant stood frozen in place for a long moment. As the cabin remained eerily quiet, she felt her pulse quicken and the heat rising in her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers still on her, but they weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting for her to do something. They were waiting for her to make it right. And then something shifted within her, something that had been buried beneath the surface of her professional demeanor, something that Freeman had brought to the surface with just a few words of wisdom and a quiet reminder of what truly mattered in life. She took a deep breath and slowly turned back toward the elderly woman, her gaze softening as she walked back down the aisle toward her. The flight attendant stood there for what felt like an eternity, her breath shallow, her heart beating faster with every passing second. The elderly woman's eyes never left her. She could feel the weight of the woman's gaze, but it wasn't harsh or accusing. It was something softer, something more vulnerable, something that made her feel even more ashamed of the way she had acted before. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one dared speak. No one moved. The quiet was almost unbearable. The passengers were waiting. They could feel the tension, the moment of reckoning. But no one knew what would happen next. Would the flight attendant take responsibility for her actions? Or would she continue to let the moment slip away, as if it never mattered at all? The flight attendant swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew she had been wrong. She knew it from the moment she had spoken to the elderly woman with such cruelty, but she had been so focused on doing her job, so focused on rushing everyone through the boarding process, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. She had failed to see the person in front of her, the human being who deserved respect and kindness, no matter their age or speed. She took a hesitant step forward, and the room seemed to lean in with her. She could feel the eyes of every passenger on her now. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting for her to take action, to right the wrong that had been done. But in that moment, it wasn't just the elderly woman who needed her. It was everyone on this flight who needed her to show them that kindness still mattered, that human decency still had a place in a world that often forgot. The flight attendant's mind raced as she reached the elderly woman's row, her hands trembling as she stopped beside the seat. She looked down at the woman, who was now looking up at her expression soft, but still filled with the traces of hurt, the kind of hurt that couldn't be easily erased. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in her throat. It was the first time she had apologized so genuinely to anyone in her career, and she knew it wasn't enough, it could never be enough, for the way she had treated the elderly woman, but it was a start, it was a beginning of something she hadn't expected. The elderly woman looked up at her for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity in her words. Then her lips curled into a small smile, a fragile smile, but one that carried warmth and forgiveness, something that the flight attendant hadn't anticipated, but desperately needed to see. "I understand, dear," the elderly woman said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sure you were just trying to do your job." The flight attendant's heart clenched at the woman's words. She felt a wave of guilt wash over her. But it wasn't just guilt. It was also something else, a realization that she had a responsibility, not only to follow the rules, but to do so with compassion and empathy, something she had forgotten along the way in her pursuit of efficiency and perfection. She took another deep breath, and for the first time in a long time she truly saw the woman in front of her not as an inconvenience, not as someone slowing her down, but as a person who deserved respect, who deserved kindness. "I'm really sorry," the flight attendant repeated, this time with more conviction, her voice steadier, as she looked directly at the elderly woman. "I promise I'll do better from now on." The elderly woman nodded, her eyes still kind, her smile deepening slightly as she reached out and placed a gentle hand on the flight attendant's arm, a gesture of forgiveness, a gesture that spoke louder than any words could. For a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed to exhale together, as if the tension had lifted, and in that moment something changed. The passengers, who had been watching in silence, felt the shift too. They knew that what had just happened was something important, something that went beyond the routine of the flight. It was a reminder of what truly mattered in life: kindness, understanding, and the ability to recognize when we've done wrong and take steps to make it right. The flight attendant stood there for another beat, her hand still resting gently on the elderly woman's arm. She wasn't sure what to say next, but she didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was filled with something deeper than words, something that transcended the moment, something that connected them both in a way that neither could explain but both could feel. And as the attendant finally turned and walked back toward the front of the plane, the cabin remained quiet for just a little longer. The passengers, who had witnessed the moment, still processing what they had seen, but also feeling the warmth of the interaction, the way it had unfolded before them with grace and humanity, something they hadn't expected, but desperately needed to witness in a world that often felt too rushed, too cold. As the flight attendant walked back down the aisle, her movements were slower, more deliberate, her eyes no longer focused on the tasks at hand, but on something deeper, something that had changed inside her. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but this time it wasn't judgment. It wasn't the silent expectation that she would do her job and move on. It was something else, something softer, something that spoke of quiet approval, something that made her heart beat a little faster. She passed by the rows of seats, feeling the weight of every gaze following her. It wasn't uncomfortable now, it wasn't cold or accusatory, it was warm, it was understanding. And for the first time she realized just how powerful kindness could be, how a single moment of vulnerability could change everything, how a simple apology could open doors she hadn't even known were there. She glanced back toward the elderly woman, whose eyes were still on her. The woman smiled again, a genuine smile that spoke of forgiveness and grace, and in that smile the flight attendant saw something she hadn't seen before, a reflection of herself, The woman was not weak. She was strong in her own way. She had endured years of life, and yet in that moment she chose to forgive without hesitation, without bitterness. The flight attendant swallowed hard as she reached the front of the plane. She paused for a moment just before entering the galley, her hands resting on the side of the partition. As she took a deep breath, the weight of the moment still sitting heavily on her shoulders, but now in a way that felt like a relief, like the burden of rushing and ignoring people had finally been lifted. She turned to face the crew member who was standing in the galley silently watching her, but there was no judgment in their eyes, only curiosity. "You okay?" the crew member asked gently, sensing the shift in the air. The flight attendant nodded slowly, her throat tight, as she tried to find the right words, but they didn't come right away. Instead, she just nodded again, her eyes still haunted by the image of the elderly woman's kind smile and the look of forgiveness that had been given to her without a second thought. "I messed up," the flight attendant said quietly, her voice raw, but steady now. "I was so focused on getting things done, I didn't see the person right in front of me. I didn't see her until it was too late." The crew member said nothing, but the look in their eyes told the flight attendant everything. They didn't need to say anything, because they understood. They had seen it too. They had seen how easy it was to get caught up in the rush of things, the urgency of the job, but also how rare it was to see someone truly step back and acknowledge the importance of kindness in that moment. "It's not too late," the crew member said finally, her voice soft but firm. "You made it right, you apologized. That's all you can do." The flight attendant nodded again, and for the first time since this flight began, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, a peace she hadn't known she needed, but now couldn't ignore. As the plane continued its journey, the flight attendant moved through her tasks with a new sense of purpose. Her interactions with the passengers were warmer, more attentive. There was a lightness in her steps now, as if the weight that had been pressing down on her for so long had finally been lifted. She smiled more, her voice was softer and more genuine as she moved up and down the aisle, helping people with their needs, and even stopping to check on the elderly woman once more. The elderly woman was resting her head against the window, now her eyes closed in peaceful sleep, but the flight attendant could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest. She paused for a moment, looking at the woman, feeling a sense of gratitude that she hadn't expected. She had come into this flight not knowing how much this one moment would change her, but now she knew she was different. She would never be the same again. She felt a quiet sense of pride settle over her for the first time in a long while. She had done something that mattered, not just for the job, not just for the passengers, but for herself too. She had taken a step toward becoming the person she wanted to be, the person who saw others, who respected them for who they were and not just what they could do for her. The plane began its descent, and as the seatbelt sign flashed on the flight attendant, moved into her final rounds, checking that everyone was secured and ready for landing. But as she passed by each row, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. She saw the small gestures of kindness from the passengers to one another, a shared smile between two strangers, a helping hand extended to someone struggling with their bag, and suddenly the cabin didn't feel so cold anymore. It felt warm. It felt like a place where kindness was valued, a place where people weren't just moving through the motions, but were truly connected to each other. And when the plane finally touched down, and the passengers began to gather their things, the flight attendant found herself watching the elderly woman one last time. As she stood to leave, the woman turned toward her and offered a final smile, a smile that held everything in it: gratitude, forgiveness, and a deep sense of understanding. The flight attendant returned the smile, and for the first time in a long time she felt like she had done something right, something that truly mattered. The plane had finally touched down, and as the passengers began to gather their things and move toward the exits, the flight attendant moved through the aisles with a different kind of energy. She felt lighter somehow, as if something inside her had shifted, something that had been weighing her down for far too long. And now she was free from it. She smiled at the passengers as they passed by, thanking them for flying with them. Even though it was just routine for her, it felt different today. The words felt more sincere, more meaningful than they ever had before. She couldn't help but notice the small gestures of kindness that had begun to spread among the passengers. She saw the young man helping an elderly woman with her carry-on bag, the mother comforting her crying child with a gentle whisper, and the quiet smiles exchanged between strangers as they shared the space together. In those brief moments it felt like something had changed, not just within her, but within the entire cabin. A ripple of kindness had spread through the flight, and it had started with a single act of compassion that had now ignited something far bigger than she had expected. The elderly woman had already left her seat and was slowly making her way toward the exit with the help of a fellow passenger. When their eyes met across the aisle for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them standing in the middle of the bustling cabin. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat as the elderly woman smiled warmly at her. And that smile, it wasn't just an ordinary smile. It was the kind of smile that spoke of understanding, a smile that told the flight attendant everything she needed to know. The elderly woman stopped for a moment and placed her hand gently on the flight attendant's arm. The touch was soft, but it carried the weight of something unspoken, something deep within the flight attendant's chest, stirred in that moment, something she hadn't expected to feel, but now couldn't ignore. The woman didn't say anything she didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. She had forgiven her. She had seen the flight attendant for who she truly was, beneath the uniform, beneath the mistakes, beneath the rush and the coldness of the job. And for the first time in her life, the flight attendant felt seen in a way she had never been before. The elderly woman nodded once, her eyes sparkling with a quiet wisdom, and then she turned and walked toward the door, but not before giving one last glance over her shoulder. She didn't need to say anything more. Her silent gesture spoke volumes, more than words ever could. The flight attendant stood frozen in place, watching her leave, and in that moment she knew she had been given something priceless, something that could never be taken away, no matter what happened next. As the last of the passengers disembarked, the flight attendant slowly made her way to the cockpit to check in with the pilots. She was still processing everything that had happened, the words of Freeman still echoing in her mind. Respect, kindness, understanding, they weren't just words anymore. They were a call to action. They were the foundation of something bigger, something that transcended the daily grind of her job. They were a reminder that every person she encountered deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She stood in the galley for a few moments, staring out of the small window at the bright blue sky outside, her thoughts drifting as she considered how far she had come from the woman who had walked onto this plane that morning, so focused on efficiency and speed that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She had been caught up in the demands of the job, the pressure to get things done quickly and perfectly. But now she saw it all so clearly. She realized that no matter how fast you go or how perfect your actions are, it means nothing if you don't take the time to see the people around you. The door to the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped out to give her a small nod of acknowledgement, and she returned it with a smile. It wasn't a smile of forced politeness. It was genuine. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing something had changed inside her, the kind of smile that came from realizing that she had grown, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. As she made her way toward the exit, she looked around one last time at the cabin. It was empty now. The passengers were all gone. But the feeling of warmth, the feeling of connection, remained with her, and as she stepped off the plane and into the bright sunlight, she took a deep breath and smiled again, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew she was different now, and she was ready to take on whatever came next with the kindness and respect that every person deserved. Days passed, and the flight attendant found herself returning to the same routine she had followed for so long, but something was different now. It wasn't just the job that had changed, it was her perspective. It was the way she saw the passengers, the way she interacted with them. Everything had shifted. In a way she couldn't explain. She no longer viewed them as just a part of the job, as faces in a crowd or numbers to be managed. She saw them for who they were, real people with real lives and stories and struggles. One evening after a long flight, she was walking down the jet bridge, heading back to the terminal, when she caught sight of something that made her pause. It was the elderly woman again. She was sitting in the waiting area alone, her hands folded neatly. In her lap, her eyes focused on something in the distance. The same peaceful expression from before was on her face, as if nothing in the world could shake her calm. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see the woman again. Not so soon, anyway. She felt a sudden rush of emotion wash over her, a mixture of gratitude and guilt, and something else she couldn't quite put into words, something that made her want to go over and speak to the woman, but she hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure if she even deserved to approach her after everything that had happened on the flight. But then the elderly woman looked up, and their eyes met across the room, and in that moment the flight attendant knew she had no choice. The woman had already seen her. There was no turning back now. The elderly woman's smile was the same warm smile from before, and it was as if everything that had transpired between them had been forgiven in that simple gesture. The flight attendant took a deep breath and walked over to her, unsure of what to expect, but determined to do the right thing. She stood in front of the elderly woman for a moment before speaking, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I just wanted to thank you again for your kindness on the flight. It meant more to me than you could know." The elderly woman looked up at her with those same wise eyes and nodded slowly. "You're welcome, dear. Kindness is never wasted." The flight attendant felt a lump form in her throat at the simplicity of the words. They were so gentle, so profound, and yet so true. It was as if the elderly woman had unlocked something inside her, something that had been buried deep within her heart for a long time. "I'm still learning," the flight attendant said quietly, her voice cracking just a little. "I've been so focused on the wrong things for so long. I didn't even realize how much I was missing, how much I was hurting people by not seeing them truly." The elderly woman reached out and placed her hand on the flight attendant's arm, once again her touch light but reassuring. "We all have our lessons to learn, dear. No one is perfect, but we can always choose to do better, to be better, and that's all anyone can ask for." Tears filled the flight attendant's eyes as she nodded slowly, the weight of the woman's words settling deep into her soul. It was as if the entire flight had been a lesson in humility, a lesson in humanity. And it wasn't just about the apology, it wasn't just about the act of kindness. It was about everything that followed: the recognition of the power of respect, the realization that every person mattered, and the understanding that kindness wasn't just an action, but a way of being, a way of seeing the world and each other. The elderly woman stood up slowly with a small groan, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked at the flight attendant one last time, her eyes shining brightly with wisdom, and then she turned to leave. But before she walked away, she paused and turned back to look at the flight attendant again, her smile now softer, more knowing. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice filled with warmth and care, "and remember that kindness is never too much." The flight attendant watched as the elderly woman walked away, her heart full of gratitude, her mind filled with everything that had happened, everything that had changed. She realized that in the grand scheme of things, the flight was just a small part of the journey. It was what happened after the flight that truly mattered. It was how we treated the people we encountered, the moments we shared with them, and the lessons we learned along the way. As she stood there in the terminal watching the elderly woman disappear into the crowd, the flight attendant felt a deep sense of peace. She knew she wasn't perfect. She knew she would continue to make mistakes. But she also knew that she was on the right path. Now she had learned something that couldn't be taught in a manual or a training session, something that couldn't be rushed, something that came only with time and reflection, and the willingness to change. And with that knowledge, she walked back to her team, her shoulders a little straighter, her smile a little brighter, and her heart a little fuller, because she knew she had done something truly important, not just for the passengers, not just for the job, but for herself too. She had learned the true meaning of respect and kindness, and that was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The days following that final encounter felt different for the flight attendant. Everything seemed to slow down for her. She found herself looking at the world through new eyes. Her interactions with passengers became more personal, more real. She began to notice the small things, the quiet smiles exchanged between strangers, the soft words of encouragement between people who had never met yet shared a brief moment of understanding. She had become attuned to these moments, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to everyone around her. It wasn't always easy. The job was still demanding. The passengers still needed assistance, and the schedule was as packed as ever, but the flight attendant had learned to approach everything with more patience, more empathy, and more awareness. She no longer rushed through her tasks. She took her time to truly engage with the people she encountered. Her presence became a comfort to the passengers, a calm amidst the bustle of the flight, and she could see the difference in their reactions, the way they smiled when she approached them, the way they spoke to her, as if they recognized something in her too. One afternoon, as the plane descended toward its destination, she found herself walking down the aisle, checking on the passengers, making sure they were comfortable, when she noticed an elderly man struggling to fasten his seatbelt. He was frail, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to secure the buckle. The flight attendant immediately knelt down beside him, offering a soft smile. "Would you like some help with that?" she asked, her voice gentle and reassuring. The man looked up at her with tired eyes, but there was a flicker of relief in his gaze as he nodded, "Yes, please." He murmured, his voice cracked with age and fatigue, but there was gratitude there too. The flight attendant took his hand, gently guiding it to the buckle, and with careful precision she fastened it for him, her touch soft but confident. She didn't rush. She made sure he was secure and comfortable before standing up again. "There you go, all set," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you so much," the elderly man said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It's been a while since I've flown on my own. I wasn't sure I could do it, but you made it easy." The flight attendant's heart swelled with warmth at his words. She hadn't expected to be thanked for such a small act of kindness, but in that moment she realized it wasn't the size of the gesture that mattered. It was the care behind it, the willingness to help someone in need, no matter how small the task. And she could see it in the man's eyes. He didn't just appreciate the help, he appreciated the fact that someone had taken the time to notice him. Someone had seen him not as a burden, but as a person worthy of kindness. As the flight continued, she moved through the cabin with a quiet sense of satisfaction, not because she had done something extraordinary, but because she had done something real, something that came from a place of genuine care and concern. She wasn't just performing her duties anymore. She was living her values. She was embodying the lessons she had learned on that fateful flight with the elderly woman, the lessons of empathy, respect, and the power of kindness. Later that evening, after the plane had landed and the passengers had disembarked, the flight attendant walked through the terminal heading toward the staff room, her mind still replaying the moment with the elderly man. She couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had clicked. Something had shifted in a way that she couldn't explain, but deeply understood. She was no longer just going through the motions. She was present. She was truly present in the lives of the people she interacted with, and that presence was everything. As she sat down in the staff room, the weight of the day settled over her, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a sense of fulfillment, a sense that she had done something meaningful, and even though it might have seemed small to others, she knew it wasn't small at all. The kindness she had shown today would ripple out into the world, and that ripple would continue long after the day ended. She looked out the window of the staff room and saw the planes lined up on the runway ready for their next flight, and in that moment she realized that every flight, every interaction, every moment had the potential to change lives, to make a difference in ways she had never imagined before. And it wasn't just the big moments that mattered, it was the small ones, the moments when she chose to see the people in front of her, the moments when she chose to be kind even when it wasn't easy. The flight attendant stood up and took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter where she went or who she met, she would carry the lessons of that day with her always. She would carry the knowledge that kindness was never too much, that respect was never wasted, and that every person had a story worth hearing. And with that thought, she walked out of the staff room toward the next flight, ready to face the world with an open heart and a renewed sense of purpose.